Chapter 1: Disciplines of Art. In order to have an efficient learning process, it helps to comprehend the basic terminology and language of the lessons being taught, regardless of the class itself. So I will be sharing with you all a table of contents that's going to help you determine what you're learning at any given time and understand any issues that arise during your feedback or any type of self-correction for your own artwork. I want to first mention that this list has helped me tremendously in my art education and career even to this day. I was fortunate enough to learn this through my mentor, Marshall Vandruff, who's been famous for teaching here in Southern California. He's very influential to a lot of famous artists working in the industry today. He has passed this down from Drew Struzan, who's a famous artist in the film industry. Even if you haven't heard of his name yet, you've probably have seen some of the movie posters he's worked on, as you see here. All the way from Indiana Jones, Star Wars, Back to the Future, and Harry Potter. Now with that said, we'll get on to the list itself. Now, the first thing we usually learn in any introductory art class is technique. Technique is basically learning how to use our artistic tools, also known as art mediums. Art mediums are simply the art supplies you use to create a work of art. So whether your medium is pencils, pens, watercolor, Photoshop, or oil paint, there's going to be a lot of lessons on how to use each particular medium. Some samples of this will include knowing how much water to paint ratio you need in order to put a proper wash of watercolor on a particular paper. It can also include a very fundamental principle in oil paints itself, where you're going to use a very thinned out layer at the bottom as you apply it to your canvas. And as you progress in your painting, you're going to need to add more oil so that it can dry properly when you finish out your painting. And in Photoshop, even simple tools such as cropping, level adjustments, and even trying to figure out what kind of pixels you need for your canvas size are all very important details to be aware of. Let's take a look at some sample artwork from some of my favorite artists using different mediums with very similar subjects. This first artist is Alphonse Mucha, who's using a combination of watercolor and ink for his mediums. On the very center, we have the master John Singer Sargent using oil paint for this large painting. And to the very right, we have Ruan Jia using the digital medium such as Photoshop to create his illustration here. Now, technique will also refer to how we apply the medium itself. Artists can be using the same mediums as another artist, but when used differently in the process, the outcome can be varied significantly. Sometimes this can be what sets a distinctive style from one artist to another. For this next set of samples, we're going to take a look at different artists using the same mediums, but applying it in different manners. For the next set of samples we have here, we have artists that are all using oil paints. The one to the very left, we have Chardin using a glazing technique where he would apply thin layers of paint onto each layer so that it'll be transparent and the colors from the bottom will show through. It doesn't do it justice to see it on a computer screen or even a book. If you get the opportunity to see something like this in person at a museum, you'll notice how the effect of the fruits and the materials of the objects themselves look like they're glowing. In the very center, we have Sorolla, where he would use oil paint a little bit thicker, and he would use a wet onto wet technique so that he'll get a nice flow among his edges and lines. To the very right, we have a contemporary artist, Jeremy Mann, using very thick paints, and where he'll use not just a brush, but a palette knife to scrape the paints and move it around. That way he can capture the type of mood and feeling in his paintings where it feels a little edgy and rough. Also to depict the wetness of the sort of environment he's capturing. As you can see, there are endless possibilities on how art can look just on the different tools available to us artists. So it's quite important to understand the properties of the tools we're using when we're creating a piece of artwork. The second category is draftsmanship. Now, some of you may have heard of this term already, but looking at the dictionary or a simple online web search, you're going to find that draftsmanship means someone whose job is to prepare very detailed drawings of machinery, equipment, or some kind of building. Or to simply say that a person is a good draftsman means that they're very skilled at drawing. However, in order to quantify draftsmanship, we're going to need to break it down into these subcategories. The first subcategory is anatomy. Anatomy is basically learning what something is made out of. Learning human anatomy is very important if you want to be a character designer, portrait artist, or an illustrator with figures in it. So learning the parts of a skeleton and major muscles is helpful when creating these from imagination and design these subject matters. This, of course, would be the same for other living subjects such as animals, plants, and anything else you could find in nature. To illustrate a sample of understanding anatomy very well, here we have Jonathan Kuo, who's an artist that I've had a pleasure of taking a class from. I took an animal drawing class from him, and he took us to field trips, going to the zoo and museums to learn about the functions of these animals, both alive and extinct. For the sample on the left, he did a demo of large cats where he would show us the differences between a saber-tooth and a lion and all the general anatomy that a cat has. And the sample to the right is his creature design. He's a concept artist, so he has to make things up from imagination and put things together from references. And what makes his artwork so great is his deep understanding of anatomy. And you can see him apply the muscles and functionality of something like a cat into his work such as this. Once again, we have John Singer Sargent with a couple of drawing studies that he did for studying human anatomy and also the anatomy of drapery. Now, even though John Singer Sargent mostly painted from observation versus designing from his imagination, he's still applying all the things he learned from his initial studies in order to produce and design a better oil painting such as the one on the right. Now, anatomy doesn't just end there, since it's important to think about other things such as man-made objects like cars, tanks, trains, airplanes, and even buildings. Someone who studies the anatomy of buildings are basically architects. So understanding your subject is a great first step into having a more sound piece of art. The second category is perspective. Since we're trying to create the illusion of a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional medium, such as a piece of paper, canvas, or computer monitor, we're going to need to understand certain perspective principles in order to create the illusion of depth. There are many great dedicated perspective classes here in CGMA, but we're going to apply a few basics such as 1-point and 2-point perspective. Also, a little bit of atmospheric perspective that we can observe out in nature and apply it in our own projects for this term. I understand that perspective can sometimes be an intimidating and very difficult subject to learn. However, once you master it, you can see that the rewards are great, such as these awesome examples from Gary Meyer on the left. We have Scott Christensen on the very right, and Ralph McQuarrie in the center. The third and last subcategory in this list is rendering. This category is focused on the understanding of light. To render something in art is to help create the illusion of light being cast on a subject with different materials as well. This could be the natural light from the sun or a man-made light source such as a lamp. Rendering also encompasses being able to illustrate and understand certain materials like plastic, fur, metal, wood, glass, etc. Each surface material will be inherently different and have a set of visual cues that make them recognizable. Rendering is the physics and reality of the world we are illustrating. The next sample we have here is John Berkey, who designed many spaceships and other sci-fi fantasy subjects such as this. Now, of course, the spaceship doesn't exist in real life. However, it looks very realistic because of the lighting. And in order to light something like this from your imagination, you'll need to understand very basic principles of how light affects an object, such as the sphere illustrated to the right. As you can see, learning to be a draftsman is basically like learning the science behind both natural and man-made subjects. Knowing and understanding these principles help us communicate to our viewers a sense of reality into our work. Without it, it makes it harder for our viewers to relate and understand some of the things we're trying to communicate to them through our artwork. What will happen is everything will become too abstract and confusing if our viewers don't have a sense of reality to help them ground themselves with things we observe with the world around us. Our last and final category is design. This is a very large subject with many subcategories within it. To name a few of these key subjects that belong in this category would be composition and storytelling. Smaller categories would be creating focal points, visual balance, creating contrasts with opposites, and finding rhythm and pattern and gestures. In a nutshell, this is where the artist lives, as these principles are all about the creative process. We create these design elements by choice in order to elicit an emotional response from our audience. After all, we create a piece of art to make people feel happy, sad, or a sense of excitement. We can even simply pique their curiosity in order to create interest so we can tell them a story. Of course, compositional storytelling and design is going to apply to illustration, such as this one here by Bernie Wrightson, all the way to film, such as the screen capture from the movie Blade Runner 2049. In conclusion, this table of contents might seem short and simple, but it contains many areas of extensive study. We definitely cannot tackle them all in one class, let alone one semester. However, we will touch upon many of these principles and put them into practice through the many assignments this term in order to benefit our own personal work and projects. So I really hope you're all excited for the fun assignments and projects to come.